So welcome to this week's episode of Tree Lady Talks. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, we talk a lot about development and nature on this podcast, and I thought it's about time we spoke to an innovative architect. And I was really pleased that Gary Winn, who is a listener to the show, reached out to me and explained about the fantastic work he's been doing, and also his recent doctorate, which is so applicable to this podcast and what our listeners are doing every day. So Dr. Gary Winn has got the most letters after his name that I've ever seen. He must have a very long business card, but he's very modest. But I'm going to ask him to introduce himself. So Gary, tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I don't have a business card at all. But yeah, I mean, professionally, I've been working as an architect since 1992, and I set up my practice very soon after qualifying. And my sort of architectural philosophy enjoys tree building relationships. And for the last 15 years, I've been working as an arboriculturalist as well. And so I like to think of myself really as a practicing architect that creates
I love that. Arbitect, you heard it here first. And listeners, in case you're any arbs listening to this who might be jumping up and down in their car seat whilst driving, Gary is qualified, and we're going to come on to that, because I tell you, Gary, you will know that some arboriculturalists think that architects are doing their job for them, but that's not you. So do carry on.
Well, my research has shown the opposite, actually, in that, this is a really good time to point this out. How did I become an arboriculturalist? Well, as I say, I'm very interested in the natural world. I've spent my whole career trying to blur the line between built and natural environments to create what I call the environment, just pure environment. It's very much a big part of that. And so I've always been, quite keen on trees. And I think they are actually pure architecture. Maybe we'll touch on that a bit later.
Definitely.
So I realised that during my architectural training, both my academic and practice, I hadn't learned anything about trees whatsoever. And I began to wonder, was this just me and my experience, or was it architects in general? And so I began to ask around other architects, and they sort of saying, well, we know quite a bit about trees. That made me worry that I'd missed out. Perhaps I didn't go to that lecture, or perhaps I wasn't listening that day. But I still couldn't help wonder the evidence that I saw out there where architects were removing trees unnecessarily or moving their buildings away from them, so there was no relationship between the tree and the building. That it troubled me a little. So, I did embark on this doctorate, and part of that, I carried out a series of workshops. And the first question I asked in the first workshop was, do you know anything about trees? Do architects know anything about trees? That's what we're going to explore today. And likewise, they again told me how much they knew about trees. So this was the time and the place to start drilling down into just how much they did know. When I drilled down, I realized that what they thought they really knew was based on the media, what their parents had told them, rusty O-level stuff. It wasn't really significant at all. For example, none of them knew what photosynthesis was. So this was a really good point for me, and I almost rejoiced, because at this point, I'd also reviewed every syllabus, architectural syllabus at both undergraduate and postgraduate level at all the universities in the UK to see what arboricultural education was in there. And sustainability came up quite a lot, but the word tree wasn't even mentioned.
Wow.
My inclinations grew stronger. The architects knew very little about trees, and that following workshop proved it. Because in that first workshop, I gave them a brief to design a building on a site where there were lots of trees. And once we'd examined the outcome of their sketch designs, every single one either had trees removed or had major conflict. And they had no idea how to mitigate that conflict. And so then I thought, there's a doctorate in here somewhere. So I pursued that. That was the starting point for the work, really.
That's absolutely fantastic because you identified a potential problem. You were curious about how much architects knew about trees. And I think a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, as they say. And you really identified through a workshop that there's an education gap. I mean, I think many listeners will have had a similar experience. So I've approached architectural colleges in the past and offered my services for a free lecture, and I never had a single reply. And I believe strongly in collaboration between different disciplines. I think equally architects should have a session on an arboricultural course or a landscape architecture course. I think there needs to be a broader understanding. And certainly for those of us who work in trees planning and construction, we hope that architects at least know when to ask. So, through your workshop, did you have a sense that they would know and when they would ask for help?
Well, when the planning authorities wrote back and said we need an arboricultural assessment, and at that point, what made me concerned was, and I'd experienced this in my own practice as well, up until 2009, that sometimes it wasn't possible to mitigate the conflict between the trees. And some
Mm-hmm.
trees were protected and they couldn't be removed. So schemes were being aborted or lots of work were being aborted. And that was very important to me because I had also asked myself the question, well, do architects need to know anything about trees? Isn't that the arboriculturalist's job to do that for them? And of course, this was part of my experience leading up to me deciding to study arboriculture. I I had a site actually. Sorry if I'm going off on a tangent, but it's a
No, no, it's
very,
interesting.
very interesting case study. I was appointed for a really exciting project, and it was on a very narrow strip, right on the edge of a canal bank. And our site was about 3 meters higher than the canal, but the canal bank itself was absolutely covered in trees, and they were TPO'd. Well, I had this architectural dream. I was seduced into this concept of having a building amongst the trees, that you lived amongst the canopy, you lived amongst nature, you saw through the trees along the canal. There's a big blurring of the line between natural and built environment. And I had this great idea that I was going to put the building on there until along came a very, very eminent arboriculturalist to tell me that all the things I wanted to do just couldn't be done. I'll just take you through the conversation, actually.
Yes, please.
I won't mention his name, but he's very, very high up in the arboricultural world. I'll tell you after. Um,
Yeah.
and so I put my building along the edge of the canal bank, and he said, you can't put your building there because the roots need access to oxygen. And if you put your building on there, you'll compact the ground, and they won't gain access to oxygen. And of course, you can't remove the trees because they're TPO'd, but in any case, the bank is reliable on its structural stability through the tree roots. And I said, well, I have I have no desire to remove the trees. The design is that is part of the architecture. And so I thought it was a bit presumptuous that he thought I was going to place my building directly on the soil, but I let it go. So I said, what would happen if I put my building where I'm proposing it, but I didn't compact the roots? Would that be acceptable? And he just said maybe. And I thought, well, okay, then I'll come back and I'll come up with some technical solutions. And the second thing he said to me was, you can't put your building in that position because the foundations will sever all the roots of the trees, and that will make the canal bank structurally unstable and damage the trees, be detrimental to the trees. So I had to think of a way how I could anchor my building there, structurally support it and protect the bank. And I said, if I could come up with a solution, would that be acceptable to him? And he said, maybe. And then thirdly, he said, canopies grow. He looked at me as if I was a fool, really. Canopies grow, and your building's going to be in the way. So you can't put your building there because, but as the canopies grow, then, it's going to conflict with the building. So I said, how about if the building wall wasn't flat and it was undulated, and maybe there were balconies in there. So as the trees grew into those concaves in the face of the new building wall, then people would be amongst the nature, and we can build the distances, and we can calculate the curves within a 5-year growing plan, and we can build a management plan into management of the trees because they are TPO'd. Would that work? And predictably, he said, maybe. And so I went away, and what I decided to do was, first of all, in address to the tree root situation, was I raised my floor above the ground about 400 mil, and so the air flowed underneath. He was happy with that. I connected my building to the ground using piles, shortboard piles, after we had a radar scan to accurately locate the building, and he was happy with that, and he was happy with the shape of my wall. His report actually worked with my design. We submitted it, we got planning permission, so that all worked out well. The other thing that really struck me about this conversation was that I started to reflect on other conversations that I'd had with other arboriculturalists, and I realized there was a bit of a power play. The arboriculturists knew so much more about trees than me, and unless I couldn't challenge them arboriculturally because I knew nothing about trees. So I believe that, do architects need to be arboriculturalists? No, but to have some arboricultural knowledge really enables that kind of communication with your fellow professional, an arboriculturalist, that enables buildings to be constructed and sites to be developed. That at first face may appear undevelopable. And at this point, I thought, I really do need to know so much more about trees. So I don't do anything by half. So I decided to embark on the level 4 arboricultural course.
Brilliant.
Spoke to Andy Summerlee.
Oh, boy, we all know what I think about Andy Summerlee. He changed my life. He's bored of hearing that now, even if he listens.
Well, Andy didn't change mine, but the course did. It enabled me to then develop these mitigation principles that I kind of discovered through the process working with the arboriculturalist. And through my doctoral research, that became what I called the tree building system. And to put that in a little bit more context, Sharon, and I know that you from your previous podcast, you've mentioned quite a lot about how you see things in a connected way. And
Yes.
I'm very much the same way. I very much perceive the world in a similar way, except I use slightly different terms. I think I used to use the word connected. I then started to use the word holistically, considering things holistically, whether it's arboriculture and architecture, or whether it's design and nature. Everything is connected. But I started to develop a perception of seeing the world as a system. And so trees became biological systems that interacted with human systems and building systems. And likewise, the tree building system grew out of that, or its terminology did. What the tree building system enabled was the mitigation of tree building conflict or potential. It enabled very close tree building relationships, which is what started to tick in and connect into my architectural philosophy. I can talk about that in a little while, actually. And then once I'd developed that system, I then began to see how that could possibly work for architects if they had a little bit of arboricultural knowledge, so they understood how to implement the system. And so I've touched on the architectural philosophy. My architectural philosophy goes way back, actually, and I've been really, really lucky to have met some really influential people. So, I mean, I know where it started. I was about 7. I used to lie on the floor with my legs up the wall, So I believe at
That's a
that
good
time,
yoga pose, isn't it, Gary? Because I'll just say, listeners, because Gary and I have never met, but we sometimes with my guests, I think we better have a pre-chat because we don't know each other at all. So I was driving to the design review panel that I sit on, which is quite a long journey to get there, and I would it be fair to say we had quite an excitable chat
yeah,
where we covered everything. It was like, whoa, that's really interesting. Oh yeah, I like that too. And you said that you like yoga and mindfulness and things like that, and that legs above the wall, the things we did intuitively as children. Often I've learnt through yoga, or I've always laid on the floor to de-stress, and grounded was something I've always done on sort of the lawn or whatever. But that legs up against the wall that you did as a child is actually really restorative, isn't it?
well, it actually ruined my back, but
It
what it
actually
did
what? Sorry.
ruined my back, I think, in
Did
later.
it? Oh
I,
dear, what? I've just said a load of rubbish, listeners.
I think
Listen, don't take exercise advice from Tree Lady Talks, okay?
I think what it did though is it enabled me to understand how I perceive the world, and so what I saw was the ground horizontal on and people's feet interacting with it. And as a young person, I used to think, where all this foot traffic comes along and it hits this floor, that surely that can't be the end of the world. There must be something beyond that space. And at the end of in our garden, we had this old oak tree at the end, and it was what I called the gateway to my nature because we lived right on the edge of the green belt, and at the end of my garden was the green belt. And so I used to I loved this tree. I had a big connection with this tree. In fact, I used to say that my hands used to fit the fissures of this tree, and I felt like we were good buddies, being an only child at that time. And so I went into the garden to explore a bit more, and I realised that as I began to reveal the earth outside, that there were these underground white woody branches, which I now understand to be roots and things. And so I knew that the earth went way beyond what it was, and that's when I didn't realise it at the time that I first made these connections between natural and built environment. And it was really, really ironic because at that time I just imagined environment, but it wasn't until I went to architecture school that above the sign to the entrance of the School of Architecture, it said, Faculty of the Built Environment. And I thought, what's this? I just thought it was environment, but hey ho, we're putting down some lines here, putting down some boundaries. So I think that was the point where I thought, well, this can't be right. The environment can't finish in the built area, and there can't be a separate one on a different island. It's all connected. So that's really how I started to develop my architectural philosophy. And when I became an architecture student, I became fascinated with the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. I was, and he had an organic philosophy, and he believed that all buildings grew out of the ground, rather like a tree responded to, or a plant responded to their environment. And on that basis, for example, it may be that a cactus would grow very well in a desert, and a bulrush would grow very well in a marsh, responding to their biological conditions in their environment. But if you transpose that and planted a cactus in a marsh and a bulrush in a desert, nothing will grow. So I've always thought that the bulrush is the architecture of the marsh and the cactus is the architecture of the desert, because that's what they've responded to, that environment. And so I very much took that on board in my design philosophy. And although I didn't actually copy the organic philosophy of Frank Lloyd Wright, I did adopt that philosophy. And I've been really lucky to go to Frank Lloyd Wright's School of Architecture twice. It was his home in the middle of the Midwest. And one visit in the early 90s, actually I think just before I qualified, I actually bumped into an Asian chap there, being in his early 80s. He was talking to me about Frank Lloyd Wright. And of course, I just done my dissertation on him, so I was full of it.
Wow.
And I was chatting away, and he started talking about a slightly different interpretation of the philosophy. And I said, well, it's interesting you say that, because I've got a slightly different take on it. And I've always wondered if I'm either diluting or not being loyal to the cause of architecture, to the organic philosophy. And this chap started saying, Frank Lloyd Wright intended us all to do this. And I thought, this sounds very knowledgeable. Turns out he was one of Frank Lloyd Wright's pupils, Wesley Peters, who I'd only read about in books. And it was just such an influential thing when he told me that what I was doing was what was meant to do. So that was fantastic.
How validating at your early stage in your career.
Yeah, and that really sort of inspired me moving on. I've been very lucky along the way as well. During my doctoral work, I managed to, I got an invite twice to Peter Aldington's house down at Turn End, and he's a really great architect that really loves landscape. And the trees there were almost touching the buildings, and that was very inspirational. He was very encouraging, and just having those opportunities of really, retaining the confidence for me to pursue what I've always believed is right, that trees and buildings can coexist in the same environment. They don't have to be in a built or necessarily natural environment. So, I'm not sure if I've answered the question or if I've...
Well, no, I mean, I've got some questions to ask you. First of all, I want to go back to the canal building, which you've got planning permission for. Was it built?
It's built. I actually went to visit it today.
Oh, brilliant. Do you have photographs of it?
I do. I took some photographs today.
Oh, well, now, listeners, remember that we have a YouTube channel at Tree Lady Talks. So what we're going to do, if it's okay with you, Gary, is it okay that we put these on the YouTube channel so people can see it?
It is. All I would say is that the photographs I took today is the trees are so happy there that at the moment they're in full leaf. You can hardly see the building.
How? But that's brilliant. And when was it built?
It's been built for about 6 years now.
Excellent. So any tree damage, not that I think there would have shown by now. And what is the use of the building?
It's multifunctional. So on the ground floor, it's a kitchen showroom, and there's a small cafe. And then above it's work-live units. So it's a 3-story building. So it just pokes above the top of these TPO'd oak trees at the moment. And you view it from the canal bridge, and it's lovely in the setting looking down the canal. But yeah, I'm going to have to wait until perhaps October when the leaves start to fall, when the building will reveal itself. That I can certainly put some photographs on there.
That will be brilliant. So check out the YouTube. So that's great. So let's talk about the technical detail of building close to trees, because with biodiversity net gain and with the quite right emphasis on nature, on canopy cover, on appropriate maximum tree retention, we're going to be doing this more and more. And as arboriculturalists, I'm sure we're quite happy with this, but where things go wrong on a lot of schemes is there isn't enough thought about the engineering, and it's the engineering, be it structural or civil, and levels that seem to make or break a scheme in my experience. So even at the planning stage where you think, well, this could work, and I'm talking about sort of larger schemes here, that size of your development and above. When it gets to the civil engineer, we've got to think about drainage, water supply, services, piling mats. So, I mean, in my experience, piling mats traditionally have to be dug down about 600 millimetres or a couple of foot. And so that is a trench. And we all know that a lot of tree roots are in the top 600 to 800 millimetres. And so you're effectively trenching those roots. So even with the great solution of using piles, I'm not talking about elevated piles here, traditional piles, you've trenched because of the piling mat. Then you have the ground beam, which is traditionally 450 square and in a cage, and then there's like anti-heave measures and then working zones. So piling, normal piling, is not a solution. So could you talk to me about the piling mat, the location and diameter of the piles, and the piling rig for that particular project, please?
Well, I can probably answer some of the questions. I wasn't there when the piling was installed, but we didn't use a ground beam at all. But I suppose it's probably worth starting with the the existing site conditions. There was a lot of build-up.
Yes.
So there was a building there, and at the back there was a car park. And so there was a lot of build-up which was stripped off. Once it was stripped off and we'd had the radar scan, we were able to plot, the best place to put the piles. And they weren't placed at the edge of the building, actually. They were placed about a third in either way.
Mm-hmm.
They supported the middle third, and the two outer thirds were cantilevered out. The piles were out of the ground, like pilotis almost, and then we cast a beam above them. So there was very little interference in the ground, and I did have to prove all of this by planning condition before they granted full planning. The piles were about 350 diameter. There were concrete piles. In later projects, we have used screw piles, but the building loading here was too great for screw piles. So we had to use concrete piles. But I think the proof is looking forward now and seeing how, like today when I went there, I couldn't see a building, and it was just full of trees. They'd flourished so well.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, I would say the only thing that's tipped the tree building relationship at this point out of equilibrium has probably been that the trees are probably thriving a little bit too much. Will they actually dominate this relationship? If it's going to be a relationship that's in equilibrium, i.e. one where it doesn't damage the building, or and that could be that it's blocking out light. It could be the canopies need trimming to allow windows to be open and feel, smell, touch the canopy almost. And that does need to be managed, and it's probably just the time of year. I would say that it's probably going to be in the autumn when the next round of management to the trees will come about.
I think you've made a really good point there, because the trees, as they grow, brushing against the fabric of the building can cause a little bit of direct damage. And then there is the sort of maybe physically not being able to open the window. I don't know about your particular design. And I mean, I don't know what species they are, but let's say there might be sycamores. That would be fairly common in that situation. Dripping honeydew. So there's sort of cleaning. There's all these what we call disservices, sort of cleaning the window, maybe sooty moulds, and then there's a shading element. Was the building, I think you may have answered this, sorry. Was the building on the north side of the trees?
That's a good point. It was. The canal was on the north side of the building. And I mean, really, I suppose it was closer than you would choose to locate the building to the trees if you had the choice, but the site was so narrow. I had no opportunity to move it over. We literally were just on the other boundary, but it was a long site. And more than anything, I saw it as an opportunity to be able to investigate and implement the architectural philosophy that I wanted when I first got there, the one that I was seduced into, the living amongst nature, viewing views down the canal through the canopy, living with the creatures of the canopy, living, sitting over my garden amongst the canopies via a balcony. So that enabled that. I didn't really see it as a negative thing, but as a positive opportunity to try and take advantage of. And that, for me, was what created the architecture of the building. For me, the building on its own would not have created the architecture that I wanted. The trees were an integral part of that philosophy. So it was an opportunity that's probably why I fought so hard with the arboriculturalists to really push them beyond what they were telling me couldn't be done. I just couldn't really accept that it couldn't be done. And if it couldn't, I wanted to be actually bottom it out and find out for real, for sure, why it couldn't be.
I really like that. Now, at the moment, I think we're in my opinion, we're at a stage of time where there's a tension between those of us who are passionate about this, understand the benefits of shading in a changing climate, the benefits to our physical and mental health of being so close to nature, particularly in an urban area, Again, I refer back to an earlier podcast with Nadina Galley, talking about, trees in our cities and towns. So that connection which we all, frankly, is essential. Hello, we're being joined by a golden retriever, and there he is. And the tension is that between, oh, well, it's going to cause shading, there's going to be pressure to prune, there's going to be objections, there's going to be a requirement to scalp these trees back to the trunks. So I think we're at a sort of, my reflection, I don't know how you feel, Gary, is that we're at a little bit of a turning point between people appreciating they need to be amongst the trees, as indeed we evolved, to being separated and everything being highly regulated. I wonder if it's going to continue to progress in the way that you and I see it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I may be biased, but I think there's a lot of evidence to back that up, and I think it's a generational change that's the difference.
Yes, I do.
I think it's my children's generation that are really seeing the true values of life. It's not about bagging money. It's about
Mm,
it's the beautiful place that we live in,
yes.
and how lucky we are to live on such a beautiful planet. So I do think that will happen, and I do see with younger architects that I work with that it's primarily on their mind, whereas perhaps architects in my cohort and above, they're still in that mentality of it's just so easier to have a clear sight. Let's
Yes, yeah.
do yeah.
That's what we need to change. And I think that one of the drivers for change is biodiversity net gain is going to be, increased policy. I mean, the previous episode was about the BS 5857 revision and the requirement for canopy cover. I'm sorry about these extremely noisy dogs doing a massive drinking session and now padding about. And so I think that is going to be a driver, but public perception should be listened to, of course. And I think everybody has a different view. One person's heaven is another person's hell, but it'll be interesting to see. So, this building sounds absolutely great, and I hope it's inspired other similar buildings in your area. And have you done anything else of a similar character?
I've worked on a really fascinating project, which was not my design, but I collaborated with some friends of mine who have a practice called BPN Architects,
Yes.
and this was a really fantastic opportunity that actually took part during my doctorate. And they had a site which was covered in trees, actually, about 30 trees. Not all of them great, but all worth keeping. And the architect's philosophy was, a younger architect, philosophy was that he wanted to keep all the trees regardless of the quality of them. There were some really nice, it was like a mini arboretum in some ways. Some of the standard ones, there were monkey puzzles, and there was some cedar of Lebanon. There's some nice trees on there. Equally, there are a lot of self-setting Hugo ones on the boundary, but as a group, they kind of worked. And what it meant was, because they were scattered around, if to satisfy the brief, which was to design a house on this site, if you designed it as a mass, as a big block, like all the other houses in the area, then you would have to remove most of the trees. So it was interesting because the relationship was that my role was pretty much the arboriculturalist. I looked at it from an architect's perspective as well. So I was able to, take on board very quickly the philosophy of this architect. And so what we decided was if you imagine getting a house and taking the lid off and shaking it like a box, and all the spaces fell about on the floor, each of those spaces become a separate module. And so we placed the living room in one module in between some trees, the kitchen in another module between other trees, the bedrooms and so on. And then we linked them with little glass bridges.
Oh, sounds lovely.
And each module was about 4 meters high. So we did have to shape some of the canopies, raise the canopies, and reduce the canopies a little bit, but not too much. We moved them to suit the canopies. We plotted all the tree constraints at this point, which changed the complexion of the design. And then we put green roofs on. the outside of the building was covered in a low-level mirror, with the idea that we'd mirror the trees, so the site became the trees, and hence the building be called the Invisible House. Um, and I also had this kind of idea that perhaps low down the canopies would get a bit of reflective light, so they could kind of photosynthesis. I kind of convinced myself that was also an added benefit. But again, this time we used screw piles, and we actually raised them above the ground about 300 mil, and we had a cantilevered step that went in, and so it was a really, really innovative building. And so the benefits of the tree building relationship, they started to grow for me during my doctoral work, away from just enabling sites to be developed, enabling trees to be kept, enabling the benefits of well-being and sustainability, bringing trees into the sustainability solution, but also that they created design innovation, because this building, although on its own merits would have been a really super piece of architecture, with the trees it went to another level.
Yes.
Yeah, and that featured in the RIBA journal, I think in October last year, maybe last summer, I can't remember. So it was a really exciting project to be working on, and I'm since collaborating with those architects and other architects on other designs, because I tend to do their arboricultural work for their projects, and because of my architectural perspective as well, it tends to rub off on the design, by
How great.
the design can be part of the mitigation in a way. Yeah.
I'd love to see some images of that. I think that sounds so, so inspirational.
Well,
I
that
wonder
is
also
documented on the web. It's called the Invisible House.
the Invisible House. Okay, we'll try and get some images of that and they'll be on the YouTube channel. So, being very practical and businesslike, one of the barriers, we've talked about the drivers, we've talked about the benefits, but one of the barriers to more innovation, such as you speak, is cost.
Yeah.
What is very approximately the increased cost, let's say, of the canal building and the Invisible House relative to its ultimate value? Is it worth so much more because of its uniqueness, and does it offset the cost? Does it balance out, or is it too difficult to say?
Again, it's very inevitably I'm going to be slightly biased, but we have to look at the evidence and the cost. So the Invisible House
Mm.
has been on the market. I think without the trees, it's not the house it is, and so therefore I think inherently it has that. And the fact that that some of the trees are really nice specimens. We did focus some of the modules around, say, the cedar of Lebanon, and that worked particularly well. I know I can't really mention the costs, but I
No,
do.
no, I don't mean actual financial value. I mean just a sort of relative feel for cost versus value, really.
I think the two cases that we've mentioned. I think the canal one really the person built that to house their own business in, and so
Yeah,
they really were looking on a budget, but it had to be able to um, be financially um, viable for them to house that business in, and we did. The foundations. I always say to people, something has to support the building. Now, in this case, it could have been very, very deep, stripped foundations with all sorts of structures to hold it in place, supporting the trees. Piles actually didn't work out that much more, and we managed to claw back some of the savings elsewhere. Um, there was a lot of glazing on the building as well to take advantage of the canal and the canopies of the trees. Um, and like all architects, you get this comment from clients saying that, well, glass is really expensive. And I always say, well, something has to keep the rain out and the weather out, whether it's brick, whether it's render, whether it's metal sheets, or whether it's glass. So it's all relative, really. It's not that labour intensive to fit glass, as it's certainly not as much as it is brick. So I think it's 6 2/3. In all honesty, there may be a slight premium because it's not the normal everyday way of construction, but neither is it unfamiliar to most, even medium-sized builders. So
that's really interesting. And I wonder also about the people's experience of living in these buildings. Have you had any feedback from the Canal House sort of tenants and also the Invisible House?
Well, I think the Invisible House is currently vacant, and I think the person that owned it lived in it for a little while. That's a difficult one. Not enough time has really passed by there. But in the canal, it's fantastic because, credit to the client. He had a bit of a social conscience that he didn't want them to be luxury penthouses. He wanted them to be affordable for first-time buyers. And so they are small, but the quality is just amazing. So
Wow.
they're in duplex apartments on the first and second floor. They work on the first floor, and in the second floor is their studio flat with the balcony. And I suppose the best way to measure it might be economically, because they've never been unlet yet. They've always been.
There you are.
Yeah, and it's not just because of the cost, because there are cheaper properties around. It is, it's just a wonderful place to live, looking above the canopies. And the estate agents say as much when they're marketing the flats. The photographs say it all, really.
Yeah. So it's worth it, folks. That's what we're basically saying. Let's
Yeah.
go back to your doctorate, which is very recent. What were
Mm.
your key findings of your doctorate?
Yeah, so I need to give you a bit of context to that, really. So I talked about a workshop earlier where we asked the question, do architects know anything about trees? Well, I used a methodology called action research. So each workshop became a cycle of action research. In the thesis itself, was cycle number 4. And in this workshop, what I did was I created a workshop which was divided into 3 parts. The first part was working with a group of architects, either on a training course or qualified, to offer them some arboricultural knowledge. It was loosely around basic arboricultural principles, like what a tree requires to be able to. And I felt that by explaining that to them, it enabled them to see how their building could damage a tree. So if it prevented that, you knew that would be an issue with your building, and that would be a major conflict. So there was some general knowledge about trees, and I showed some examples of cows under trees, sheltering from the sun or the rain, and how they compacted the ground and the damage it done to the tree. That was a useful slide. We then looked at some Maggie Centres, which, they in their design brief, they have to bring in trees in buildings, and they're.
Yes, I'm working on one at the moment. I won't say where, but it's an absolutely wonderful privilege to be part of the Maggie Centre, and it's right near some protected trees, and
Yeah.
it's causing much discussion between the various people. I'll leave that there.
Well, I was privileged enough to work with the Maggie Centres a little during my research as well. I just wrote them and offered my services and said, what can I help with? And Maggie Jenks, his husband, Charles Jenks, is an architectural theorist as well, or philosopher. And so I was familiar with these books from being a student. So there was a bit of a motivation there, really, to get involved. But what it meant was, once I'd started to show the context of a building with a healthy tree next to it to architects and explained why, using the principles from the canal bank, the penny sort of dropped, really. So this first part of the workshop acquired them with this kind of knowledge, this background knowledge. The second part of the workshop enabled them to acquire some hard skills. So what we did was we plotted 3 tree constraints. So we plotted the root protection area, and I showed them how to plot that. We plotted the canopy shapes, and I showed them how to plot the canopy shapes. I missed this section out here, but I can come to it. And then I showed them how to do a shading diagram. Now, in between the first part of the workshop and the second part of the workshop, I gave them another design challenge, and it was to design a pavilion in an arts for an arts college, real project we're working on. And they all plotted their building on the site, and then we plotted these constraints over the top. There was a lot of conflict between trees and buildings, at this stage. But you could tell from the findings that the participants had actually taken on board some of the principles that we discussed on the Maggie Centres and the Canal Bank. And so at this stage, there was a discussion, and as would be normal in an architect's design process, there were some iterations of change. So some people changed their designs to just shape the building slightly. Some people cantilevered their buildings over the root protection area. Some people used screw piles. Most people raised them above the floor where they entered the RPA. Some people had drawn sections and changed the canopy shape. So you could tell that the knowledge they'd acquired in part one of the workshop had now started to become, those theoretical building blocks are now being applied practically in their design process. And in the third stage of the workshop, we had a reflective period where we had group discussions talking about it. And then subsequently, I did some individual interviews with some of the people. And so the key findings were really, stemming back to the first workshop, that architects really knew very little about trees at the beginning of this, even the stage 4 workshop. And in fact, worse than that, a lot of them used the same terminology, that they thought trees were impediments, obstacles, hurdles to overcome, a nuisance. And there's a complete paradigm shift at the end of the workshop on where architects have now seen these mitigation principles, or the tree building system, as I called it. The utilization of that enabled them to see the opportunity, and that made me reflect back to my time on the canal bank. It was an opportunity to bring in trees as part of the design. And so they actually, at the end of the workshop, there was, I think, out of all the participants, there was only 2 trees that were removed out of all the designs. And that was for a number of reasons. One was to prioritize the design, but then actually enable some of the other trees to flourish better. Or it may be that they replaced them with other trees, and in their mind, that was a justification. But pretty much, you could see that where previously their buildings had prioritized the tree building relationship, at this point now, the trees were having their say, and the relationship was becoming more equal and more valued. And it was interesting because part of the reflective part of the workshop, I did a free writing exercise with the architects. And I said, this is a 3-minute exercise, and I want you to just put your pen or pencil on a piece of paper and just keep writing. Don't take it off or stop. Don't stop to think. Just write whatever comes into your mind. And I want you to consider this. If I were a tree, I would carry on writing.
Oh.
And what I tried to do was to get a 360-degree perspective of the tree from both the architect and the tree's perspective on the tree building relationship.
I like that.
And I know it was a bit daft, really, and I thought probably set myself up for a good kicking in my viva, but it was taken in the vein that I put it forward. I think it was valuable because the information or the evidence or the data that emerged from that were things like, I want to protect trees. I want to be amongst other trees. I want trees to be able to communicate. I want there to be trees as part of my well-being. I want to be able to protect the buildings or work with the buildings to protect the heat island increase and things like that. All the things that we hadn't really touched on were now coming in. And I kind of categorized those as each individual's practitioner's own professional motivations. So some people were heavily into well-being, some people were into sustainability, other people were into, addressing climate change. And so they could all use this tree building system in their own way to bang their own professional drum. And so it became fascinating, really, the actual key findings that came out. Other ones that people then started in the interviews to start connecting into the plugging into and connecting into the other complex parts of practice, like planning policy. Now, so one person said, well, we work in conservation areas in city centres where, the planning policies work on very hard design codes where you've got hard interfaces between building and streets. How do we fit trees in? because, that's contradictory to the national planning policy framework, where we're looking to create beautiful places now and encourage trees. And so we started to talk about things like tree pits and, you know, local environments for trees to work in, and, the relationship between the tree and the building being controlled by the tree pit. And maybe it's okay for the building in those situations to be the dominant partner in the relationship between the tree and the building. And so, that became a really key part of the discussion, how we fit it into planning. And many more came up, really. It was a lot of people reflected back on their architectural education to say things like, we had one participant who was just finished her undergraduate, told me that she'd just done a heavily sustainable architecture degree, and trees weren't mentioned. It was
Good grief.
about green roofs, green walls, green infrastructure. And she said if she'd have known this at a much earlier stage, it would have been so much more useful than just learning it in my workshop.
So, I'm sorry, but I find that extraordinary. How
Yeah,
can we get into, and I'm including brilliant landscape architects in this who are absolutely essential in the work that they do in shaping our new landscapes. How can we get in there? How can we influence in a small way the modules? What's your advice on that?
well, I think that's a really excellent question, Sharon, and I was asked it in my Viva, actually, and I wasn't prepared for it. Although I wasn't prepared, it just came off the tip of my tongue. And as an architect, seeing tree building relationships from my perspective, I see the excitement of design. That's what excites me, designing buildings. And so I've now seen how trees can, really play a very important role in the innovation and the exciting creation of innovative designs. And so I think that's the door that I open to let architects into. The Maggie Centres, as we touched on, some really innovative buildings there. We
Mm-hmm.
trees growing, buildings growing around trees.
But
Um,
perhaps we should just explain, not everybody will know what a Maggie Centre is.
yeah,
Perhaps you
well,
can just give
of
a snapshot of that.
yeah, a very brief snapshot. Maggie Centres are cancer care centres. They take care of people living with cancer, their families, and it was an idea that was put forward by Charles and Maggie Jenks. And Maggie was unfortunately diagnosed with cancer, and that's where it came from. And the design brief was that every Maggie Centre should have trees integrated within them.
Mm.
If anybody thought beyond that, they just wanted trees because of the well-being connection. And yeah, I mean, this kind of undermines my work in a little way, because you might say, well, the architects managed to do those with trees, and they didn't have any arboricultural knowledge. But as you'll know, Sharon, as the arboriculturalist, it's not seamless working with an architect, and when you're working around a tree. But I think where I kind of respond to that is that for the architect to have arboricultural consideration and building consideration within the same design thought process, that's where the magic comes out. Obviously, the arboriculturist knows all the technical stuff, and that they are needed, they're essential for that relationship. But I think that's how the Maggie Centres have evolved to become successful buildings. So yeah, the buildings, I think there's about 27, 30 of them in the country now, the UK.
Mm.
And each of them have very close relationships with buildings, some growing
Yes.
through the building, through holes in the building, some very close to them, some mature trees. And they really do help with the design of the building. And one of my participants said in one of the findings in the workshop, trees are an opportunity to enable the building, the architectural building, to be composed within the landscape. And that was beautifully put, really.
I really like that. So, um, what are your key bits of advice to? This is mostly an arboricultural community listening to this podcast, and certainly a nature-loving community. What is your advice for creating this successful relationship between trees and buildings as a system?
Well, I think first of all we have to speak to each other. I'm not being critical, but my experiences there hasn't been a lot of that. I think there's been some willingness on both parties, but it just hasn't happened. I've certainly spoken to the the board, some of the people on the board of directors of the Arboricultural Association. I've spoken to people at the RRBA, and there's a willingness to come together. But I think there has to be a forum that comes together. Maybe it's, we have conferences that allow us both to speak. It's a challenge really, because I remember 3 or 4 years ago I went to a conference, so actually on biophilia, but it was at the BRE down in Watford, and for 3 days I sat there. They were talking about buildings and vegetation and green walls and green roofs, which I'm very excited about. I kept raising the word tree, and in 3 days it was never responded to.
Wow.
Yeah.
So several things I want to say to that. The first thing, I have a very dear industry friend. Marco Bartolini, who is very active in this field. He's an arboriculturalist. He's a fantastic guy, and I know that he is speaking to RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects. Secondly, I'm going to run a conference for architects and arboriculturalists. Now, I've tried this before in a more general way, but not on my own, and you get lots of arbs, not many architects. So I'm going to do that, because I haven't announced this yet on the podcast, but I'm announcing it now, that I have a events company which I haven't yet properly launched, called Holobiont Events Limited. You won't find it yet on the internet, but the purpose of that is to bring together living systems and people who represent those living systems because of the connectivity. So I think that we can set something up, Gary.
Absolutely. I mean, this is where
Willing, if you work with me.
Well, this, as you say, what makes a connection in the system? Well, we both open our doors. I mean, you have a much greater wealth of arboricultural experience than I do. I'm certainly not the best arboriculturalist in the world, and I'm certainly not the best architect in the world. But from what I've found, I appear to be the only architect in the UK that appears to be an arboriculturalist as well, and that's shocked me.
Well, it hasn't shocked me. I really think that your curiosity and your thirst for knowledge and your, quite frankly, hard work and determination is a lesson to us all. And I think opening up your mind to different ways of seeing, that's essentially what you've done, isn't it? You've been trained in one way, but you've seen, hang on a minute, there's a bigger picture here.
Yeah.
So what next for you, Dr. Gary Wynn?
Well, I'm trying to disseminate this work, and today has been a great opportunity to talk about some of it. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you, and for all the time that you've taken up to think about that, to host that. I'm trying to claw some of it into a book, so that's going to be coming out around Christmas, though it's still with editors at the moment. I'm trying to aim it at architects and arboriculturalists as, again, another enabler to draw the professions together, because the boundaries between all of our professions should be like invisible, really. All the interfaces should overlap. We're a team. I suppose centuries ago, the universal man used to do everything, but that was centuries ago. Now we're all working individually. We should be working together. So hopefully the book will do that. I'm hoping to run some workshops. I'm a long way off doing that yet. But yeah, that will be about the creation of arbitecture. Sort of working.
Say that word again.
Arbitecture.
You heard it here first.
Yeah, and so that's something I plan for the future, and I have some academic papers in mind. One particular, the relationship or the benefits of well-being to your well-being of being amongst trees. I think it's a bit of a drum that I've been banging. Slightly, it's verging on irritated me actually, because there's a lot of literature out there on well-being and trees and being amongst greenery, but all the literature that I've read, and I've read a lot of papers over the last few years, it just appears to me, it may be the way that the criteria for putting together academic papers prevents it from being said, but it appears to me that people researchers are measuring people going out into the environment, taking down their feedback as data, and then reporting the findings as if, they go out amongst green spaces and by some kind of osmosis or by Bluetooth, they get this benefit. For me, it's much deeper than that. It's about physics. I mentioned earlier about the old oak tree at the end of my garden. How I connected was by us actually understanding what this tree felt like, how my fingers became part of the bark of that tree, or seeing how a tree moves in the wind, understanding its structure, or seeing how different trees have different leaves or different forms. That's observing and that's understanding the tree. I think by virtue of observing and understanding, that's how we feel better or it's beneficial to our well-being. And that's something that I'm interested in the near future in writing an academic paper on, because that seems to be a research gap.
So thank you very much, Dr. Gary Wynn, for your new way of opening up our eyes on successful relationships between trees and buildings, which work in terms of structure, a nice place to live and work financially, and the trees are great. Because we've never needed this like we do now with our nature crisis, and we need this now for our people, place and planet. So Dr. Gary Wynn, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Sharon. It wouldn't have happened without you, and I wouldn't have made contact had I not been inspired by the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.